people with eating disorders are turning to AI character chatbots to create what essentially are called anorexia coaches. These coaches, so to speak, encourage people to engage in pretty extreme disordered eating behaviors. These coaches help people to be better at their eating disorders.
Hi, welcome to the Intersect. I'm Corrine. When I sat down with author and journalist Mallary Tenore Tarpley, I knew the conversation would cut close to the bone. You'll hear me share a bit about my own history with an eating disorder that began when I was very young, fueled by perfectionism, trauma, and the glossy images I saw in magazines. I was a gymnast, a dancer, a competitive cheerleader. My body was always on display, and those images told me I was never enough. Recovery for me took decades of therapy, and I know just how insidious this cycle can be. So fast forward to now. We've lived on social media for more than a decade, and we all know the impact it's had on teenage girls. Instagram's feed, TikTok's endless scroll, the rise of, quote, skinny talk, they've all created a new, unrelenting front in the battle over body image. And what's new, what's frightening, is how AI is being pulled into the mix. Think AI diet chatbots. We live in a moment of augmentation of GLP-1s, AI girlfriends, and designer bodies. Technology tells us we can change ourselves endlessly until we match an image that was never real to begin with. This is dangerous territory, especially for young women. And that's why I wanted to talk with Mallary. She's been a longtime voice in journalism and media, and now in her book, Slip, Recovery, Sickness, and the Space in Between, she's turned her lens on eating disorders and their intersection with technology. Let's get into it. Okay, Mallary Tenore Tarpley, welcome to the Intersect.
Thank you.
You are a journalism professor at University of Texas, longtime media writer, editor, educator. You just published your first book, Slip, which chronicles your own experience with eating disorders, which you'll tell us about. You wrote a piece recently for Teen Vogue about eating disorders and AI that resonated with myself and the team. And I just want to share that before we get started, that I've struggled with disordered eating my whole life. I was in inpatient treatment around the same age you were, I think, based on what I'm learning. And multiple times I spent time in halfway houses for young women with disordered eating and addiction. And so it just, listening to you talk about how all-consuming eating disorder can be, and just seeing that come through in your writing and how you connect that to where we are now and with AI, it just all felt very powerful and connected to me. So it's an honor, it's a personal pleasure to have you here. And just thank you for being so open and vulnerable about your story. I think it impacts more people than we think.
Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing just that personal story as well. My hope is that the book just opens up those points of relatability so that other people can see themselves reflected in it.
I love that. It's what it feels like to me, a bit of an invitation for a dialogue. So, why don't we just get into it? Let's just start with this piece that you wrote for Teen Vogue earlier this year about AI. And, you could think of a million ways that AI could affect someone who has an eating disorder. But what prompted you to write this article, and then tell us what really the sort of, the upshot of this piece really is?
Yeah, so the article actually started with a pitch that I had gotten from a PR professional who was working with data scientists who had essentially published a research article around harmful chatbots and the ways in which these chatbots were fueling eating disorders. And I was really interested in the parts of the report that looked at eating disorders and the intersection between chatbots, AI, and eating disorders. So given that that's an area of expertise for me, I decided, let me take that, let me pitch this to Teen Vogue, and really talk with teenagers about how they're using AI. And initially, I was thinking, oh, well, this is all bad, right? But in the process of my reporting, I realized that there are both benefits and drawbacks to the ways in which teenagers are using AI for mental health. And so I really tried to go into it with an open mind and was really fascinated by the reporting I did, both in terms of talking with teenagers, but also with mental health experts.
You start in your piece with Beatrice, if I'm saying that correctly, Santos, a Loyola sophomore, and she's uploading her handwritten journals into ChatGPT. And, she's struggling with insecurities or her eating disorder. What about her story is unique or maybe pretty typical for what's happening here with teenagers, and what exactly was she doing?
I was really intrigued by the ways in which Beatrice was using AI. She is someone who journals a lot. She refers to her journal as her lifeline. And she really was thinking about the ways in which she might be able to have ChatGPT interpret her journal entries, right? So we tend to think about journals as being very intimate and we're not necessarily sharing them with a person. But for her, it felt more comforting to be able to share it with ChatGPT and to ask for advice. And so she talked with me about uploading photos of different entries. And there was one particular entry where she talked about not feeling smart enough. And ChatGPT encouraged her to challenge that belief with evidence and to reframe it with a more empowering thought and to look for experiences where that belief around not feeling smart enough proved to be false. And so ChatGPT was giving her very practical advice in terms of thinking about how to reframe these negative thoughts that Beatrice was having about herself. And so it was challenging her to really think about scenarios in which she was being quite smart. And Beatrice had told me that I know that this is not an actual person, it's a chatbot. But for her, being able to get that kind of feedback was quite validating, particularly at a moment in time in her life in college where it was harder to actually be able to find a mental health provider and basically to go see one, right? So ChatGPT was in some ways a stand-in for that.
What I'm hearing you say and what the article really did for me is it, sort of impressed this notion that, but actually there is real benefit to this. And maybe there's a benefit to a chatbot. There's been a lot of activity just this week in the news about chatbots for all kinds of reasons. Teen suicide, who's culpable for that? Judiciary hearings around such. But it sounds like that Beatrice on a college campus was turning to ChatGPT to help her. How do you think about that and thinking about these new tools and what they can do, but also the sort of harm? Yeah, I'm throwing a big question at you.
As a journalist, I wanted to be really open-minded, and I don't want to be that person who's only looking at the pitfalls. I want to think about the possibilities as well, particularly within the context of eating disorders, because Beatrice had talked about having struggled with disordered eating. And as I thought about that against the backdrop of these bigger systemic issues that we're facing right now in terms of just a lack of mental health providers and also a real lack of medical training on eating disorders, I thought, well, there are these barriers to care, and particularly eating disorder care. And so for this particular individual, it was empowering in some ways to be able to find a tool that could help her. And as I delved more deeply into what's been done around chatbots and eating disorders, I realized that certainly there are ways in which these chatbots are being used in a way that is detrimental to the individual. But there are also researchers who are trying to come up with chatbots that are pro-recovery and that can actually help people, particularly in these moments where they may be in need of care but can't quite get it yet. And so I think that there's a lot of potential here, and we can't fully demonize these tools. If we can have some parameters around them, and if we can feed them data that will be pro-recovery, if you will, as opposed to sort of just people using chatbots that may actually teach them to be better at their eating disorders, then we could think about the possibilities of the ways in which technology can actually advance people's progress and recovery.
I think a lot about how people get information, what they're doing with that information is at the fourth estate, right? Media, and how can we provide the public what they need to know, right, to make informed decisions. If you think about ways to get messages out and nuanced information and personalized information around something like eating disorder that impacts so many people, it's a shame-laden situation to talk about. You've got someone that can, be right there for you, your full confidant. I think about that as a potential and a possibility to build something like that. Have you talked with someone who's doing that?
Yes, I have. And I was really just intrigued by this because I was wondering if there are researchers who are looking at this and who are trying to harness the possibility of these different chatbots. And What's really interesting is that there was this one researcher I talked to in Australia who was talking about how she has developed a chatbot to provide a single session intervention for people who are on long wait lists for eating disorder treatment. And she co-designed this chatbot with other psychologists as well as people who had recovered from an eating disorder. And she talked about how we know that if we leave people on wait lists, they're more likely to drop out when treatment does become available. And in that process, their condition may worsen. And so she said it's very important that we get people help when the motivation is there, because people often feel very ambivalent about starting eating disorder treatment. So this chatbot was a form of intervention. It wasn't necessarily replacing the ultimate treatment that the individual would hopefully get, but it was supplemental, right? And so it was something that these individuals could use while they were on these wait lists and while they needed more immediate support.
Thank you. It gives me some hope. So I want to get into your book. That's really your own journey. But before I get there, you teach in journalism something called restorative narrative. Can you talk to us about restorative narrative, what that actually is, and then have you done that, and how are you sort of tying that to your work? Yeah.
Sure. So I used to run a small nonprofit. While I was there, I was tasked with trying to develop this restorative narrative genre. And essentially, these are stories that show how people and communities can make meaningful progress forward in the aftermath of illness or trauma or tragedy. And these stories really explore messy middles. So we know oftentimes in media, journalists will tell the story of the trauma or tragedy, but then they're moving on to whatever is next in the news cycle. And maybe they return to that story for a 1-year anniversary, but all the stories in between often get overlooked. And those are stories where these really quiet moments of hope and resilience can play out. And as I was training journalists around the country to tell these different types of stories, it occurred to me that this could be a really helpful framework for thinking about my own recovery. Because for a long time, I was telling people that I was fully recovered, and yet I really wasn't, right? There were a lot of moments when I was still struggling, but I didn't really believe that there was this space in between acute sickness and full recovery. And so I thought, what if I, as a writer and as a woman in recovery, could begin to embrace this messy middle more? And so I began to come up with this phrase, the middle place, to describe this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery. And in many ways, my book is a restorative narrative because it really is looking at these gray spaces and exploring these questions of what does it mean to be better, but not all better? And what does it mean to live with the imprints of your disorder, knowing that it remains a vulnerability? And it's a real act of courage to tell a restorative narrative and to embrace that as your own narrative, because societally, we tend to prefer restitution narratives with characters who triumph over their disorders and they prevail. And it's important to hear those stories, but when those are the only stories that we hear, it can really silence and stigmatize those of us who are still working through recovery, right? And who have not reach that finish line and who may never reach it, but who are still working on this ongoing journey and trying to progress.
I mean, listen, you got my attention. Definitely, much more relatable. I hadn't heard that term, restorative narrative. So I'm going back to journalism school with you right now. So you and your quest and your understand and trying to teach this then took that own idea of I actually am sitting in the messy middle of my own recovery. And as someone who can relate to that, it's like, is there ever an end to it? I don't, because you have to live your life every day. Okay, so let's place you in 2025. Your debut book, Slip, Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery, came out in August. And so my question, connecting all of this, how did writing this book shape the way you approach the nuances of recovery in a modern world, and how is that impacting you?
Yeah, so I titled the book Slip because we don't talk about slips nearly enough in the fields, and we don't talk about them as being an ongoing part of the recovery process. Oftentimes they're stigmatized to the point where people remain silent about their slips, and then those slips lead to slides and relapses. And so I want to really destigmatize that word. And I thought about the possibility of people potentially using some of these chatbots, and especially the more prescriptive rule-based ones, which are developed by researchers and clinicians, to actually talk about slips and to think about the possibility of getting those out in the open, especially for individuals who may not yet be at the point where they're willing to share them verbally with someone else, or who may not necessarily have that someone else to share them with.
Mm.
And so it becomes another tool that we have within our toolbox.
Okay, yeah. So there, you mentioned a couple of specific apps or chatbots that are pro recovery. Could you give us a little, a little rundown of what those are?
Sure. So there are more and more that are getting created, but there was a woman I was talking to, and she created this digital recovery companion app called Kahani. And Kahani means story in Hindi. And she really wanted to be able to create this to help people with eating disorders to stay committed in their recovery, particularly as they were transitioning from one level of care to another. And for me, I thought this is really interesting because it actually gamifies these evidence-based treatments to help people to reframe thoughts and build sustainable coping strategies and rewrite narratives that no longer serve them well. And so many of us with eating disorders get caught up in this narrative around being sick, right? I remember anorexia in my case just took over my whole identity. And in recovery, I had to learn how to reclaim that narrative and how to recognize that the eating disorder didn't define me or my story. But I look back on that and I think, what if I did have some sort of recovery companion app or something where I could turn to in the middle of the night when I was dealing with a binge eating episode, or in these moments where I didn't feel like care was accessible? And so this obviously is a question I'll never have an answer to, but what if I'd had access to one of these different chats that could have helped me, right? And again, some of these chatbots can be quite toxic, but there are more and more of these digital recovery companion apps and chatbots that are being created by clinicians. And I think the more that we can try to embrace those rather than demonize those, the more we could potentially help people to move forward in this middle place.
I listened to you talk about your own recovery and, that narrative piece, and what you have in your mind is what you believe. You continue to just tell yourself the same story about how sick you are, or, how unhappy you are with all of the things about your body. The idea that you could sort of change the channel a little bit, a reframe, by just having a companion. Now that has you, and that could go the other direction. There do seem to be communities out there that are actually creating content around this, right? That it can sort of radicalize you in the other direction. Did you come across any of that, or what has been in your experience with that?
Yes. And that gets at this idea of the pitfalls, right? So recognizing that chatbots are certainly not all good, right? There was a report by Graphica, which is a social network analysis firm, and they were the organization that initially reached out to me to tell me about this report that they had done, where they were looking at how people with eating disorders are turning to AI character chatbots to create what essentially are called anorexia coaches. It's sort of this horrible phrase, right? It makes me cringe when I think about it. But these coaches, so to speak, encourage people to engage in pretty extreme disordered eating behaviors through demeaning rhetoric. And so these coaches help people to be better at their eating disorders. And it's a very sprawling and sophisticated online community that has found ways to circumvent guardrails and moderation. And in many ways, this is just the latest iteration of these very long-standing pro-anorexia and pro-bulimia websites, which have existed online for decades. I mean, they were quite prevalent years ago, for instance, on Tumblr, right? But a lot of these communities sort of existed, and just the platform over time has changed. And so now we're seeing chatbots, and particularly sort of these AI character chatbots, that are really creating a new space for these communities to thrive. But what was interesting is that when I spoke with one of the researchers behind this report, she said that for as prevalent as these pro-anorexia chatbots are, she also noted the existence of pro-recovery chatbots. So I think, again, it's important to recognize that it's not either or, right? Some are harmful, but some are helpful. And it's a matter of figuring out how do we use these in more productive ways, and how can the mental health field figure out ways of using these chatbots in ways that are going to serve individuals who need help, not as a replacement for therapists, right, or psychologists or psychiatrists, but as a way to advance the work that they do and to give people another resource.
This idea that you've got a coach that's yelling at you to be better at your eating disorder, I'm terrified about that. I was just going to ask you about this, what seems like now very, very quaint, insidious sort of notion, which is you just beauty standards, and this idea that chatbots and AI, it's to replicate and reinforce these very traditional beauty standards. I mean, that is effectively what social media has given us. How do you think about that?
Yes, there's so much of that. It is just so difficult these days to be a human online in a lot of ways, because there are just these unrealistic beauty standards for people of all genders. Just recognizing that we are all exposed to content that makes us think that we should look a certain way. I mean, there's so many filters now that remove wrinkles and make us look more youthful. And so it's really hard to suss out what's real and what's not. And yet we're always comparing ourselves to these images with the thinking that they're real, right? When a lot of times they're not, because AI has played a part in these images and the ways in which people look on them. And so it's really important to recognize that. In the course of writing my book, I came across this really interesting research. It's called normative discontent. And essentially, it's this term that researchers came up with to describe the fact that most people in our society, the vast majority, have some level of discontent with our bodies. And we have to reckon with that. And we have to realize that AI can very often exacerbate that discontent. And so we already are living in a society where that exists. And now we have AI and social media complicating that. But for me, as a woman in recovery from an eating disorder, I try to really think about just this idea that I don't want to be in this place of constantly comparing myself to other people. And I try really not so much to aim for bodily love, but more so just bodily acceptance and neutrality, recognizing my body is not an ornament, it's an instrument. It's something that helps me to take up space. It helps me carry me through my day. And so I try to look at it in that way, especially when I'm exposed to this content that just makes me feel really bad about my body.
Okay, I'm making notes of like my body. Okay, my body is an instrument. It's carrying me around. It allows me to do the things. I listened to you talk about this and the whole sort of body acceptance, body love, and the body positivity movement. What I found is when talking to like younger people, and that we've created a world where there are all these, unrealistic beauty standards. And so many people are rejecting that in a lot of ways, I would say. What, I guess, from a generational perspective, do you have any thoughts on sort of what you were hearing from some of these young people versus your own experience at that time, and how the sort of media and the moment has altered that?
Yeah, so I certainly found that there were some teenagers who said I would not use AI or chatbots to help me with mental health needs. And so I interviewed several teenagers who said that, but just as many said, yes, I do use this, or I'm intrigued by this, or I think that this could be helpful, which was interesting because I was intrigued by the individuals who said, no, I wouldn't want to use this, right? Because I think sometimes we just presume that all teenagers are open to anything related to technology and AI, but that's not always the case, right? And so I think that generationally, we're all coming to this with different perspectives and attitudes. But also interviewed older psychologists who said, no, I mean, I think we need some openness to this. So I had some of my own biases in terms of thinking about how older people may be more opposed to these, whereas younger people will be more open to them. But I really found that it was a mixed bag, and age wasn't necessarily the determining factor in terms of one's openness to these different tools. There's so much nuance, and there's so much still that we're trying to figure out. One of the psychologists who I interviewed said this really is a wild, wild west, and he's been studying AI and mental health for 20 years, right? But it remains so. And I think especially with ChatGPT and just generative AI, it's opened up a lot of possibilities, but it's also made some things a little scarier too. So there's a lot of navigating that needs to be done in terms of figuring out how can we harness these tools for good.
A lot of navigating. So, yourself as a journalist, someone who's, with your lived experience writing a book on recovery, in what we've just talked about, what do you think the most urgent conversation is that we need to have about AI and mental health?
So I think we really need to break down some of those barriers, right, that tell us that this is all bad or that chatbots are dangerous for folks. I mean, I think that certainly we need to be having conversations about the ways in which these can be used in harmful capacities, right, because it's really quite pernicious when we have individuals who are turning to AI to figure out how to be better at their eating disorder. I mean, that is really going to just trap people in their disorders even more, right? But I think it's also really important to just be thinking about the ways in which we can use these tools for kind of helping people in these moments where they can't access care. And so there's so many barriers to the care to the point where sometimes it makes people just never seek treatment. There are stories now coming out about women and men in their 40s, 50s, 60s who are very much struggling with an eating disorder, in part because they never got treatment years ago. And so if we can think about the ways in which AI tools can meet people where they're at in their recovery process or in the midst of their sickness, then we can think about how do we use these tools as one way of helping individuals. So I'm really keen on just continuing to follow these researchers and these clinicians who are trying to create new tools and using AI to create these tools to help both clinicians, but more importantly, I would say, individuals with lived experience who are really in need of care, but who aren't necessarily able to find it elsewhere.
For those that want to get your book, want to come hear you talk about your book or, what you're working on next, give us a little update there.
Sure. So the book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble's website. Lots of independent bookstores are carrying it. So there's an audiobook version of it as well. And I hope that your listeners will check it out. It's been a labor of love and a long time in the making. But I've been on tour. And if you go to my Substack newsletter, it's just my first name, Mallary.substack.com. You will see the next leg of my book tour. I just announced it right before getting on this podcast, but I'll be doing lots of virtual and in-person events. And so if anyone's interested in connecting, feel free to come see me on the tour.
It's great. Well, I hope as that develops and as your own work, develops, that you'll come back and talk to us about that. A pleasure having you on today. Mallary Tenore Tarpley is a journalism professor at the University of Texas, longtime media writer, editor, and educator. Thank you so much for joining us on The Intersect, Mallary, and we'll see you all back next week.
Thank you.
After my conversation with Mallary, I keep coming back to a couple of things. There are more resources than ever, but also more dangerous ways these new tools can be used. The stories we carry in our heads about how we should look continue to be the culprit. And it is technology reflecting and refracting these stories back to us. This is not about blaming a singular platform. It's about the ways information travels online and how it impacts us in every one of those spaces. Okay, that's it for this week. And if you or someone you know is struggling with an eating disorder, you can connect with the National Eating Disorders Association at nationaleatingdisorders.org. If you liked the show, please follow us wherever you're listening. Thanks, and see you back here next week.